Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. In today's video, I'm just going to be going over everything that I know currently about this character, Furina, and it's going to be a long guide video, so buckle up because we're probably going to be here for a while. So I want to get straight to the point with this guide because, again, there's a lot to talk about with her because she is a fairly complex and flexible character, which makes it so, you know, it's going to take quite a while to get through all the content in this video. But I will be talking about her kit, her artifacts, stat recommendations, some techs, some little bonus advantages that she provides, as well as her weapons, and of course her constellations and teams as well. So just from the sound of that, it's a lot of stuff. So we're going to jump straight into it. Now, what is Furina all about? Furina is all about providing great off-field hydro damage via her little salon troop here. And she also buffs the team a lot and provides the team with a lot of bonus damage. So teams that absolutely appreciate having the bonus damage multiplier enhanced, they are going to really appreciate Furina. But really quick, it's time to pay some bills. And today's sponsor is Dungeon Hunter 6. Dungeon Hunter 6 is an epic, insane mobile MMORPG where you can enjoy an outlandish amounts of shiny things on your screen all at once. With super optimized multicasting and grandiloquent 3D graphics, you'll enjoy silky smooth, fast-paced, chaotic gameplay wherever you are. There are epic guild raid battles, epic boss raids, epic game modes, and even some nice casual farming. Dungeon Hunter 6 has tons of customization when it comes to outfits and mounts, so you can flex your super awesome rare mounts to everyone else. And the best, most iconic gacha feature of Dungeon Hunter 6 is the ability to defeat bosses and then loot and ride those bosses. You can summon up to 3 of them onto the battlefield to crush other bosses. With over 100 bosses and monthly updates, you'll never have a shortage of content. Just smash that link down below or scan the QR code to play for free on both Android and iOS. New players will get a special starter pack worth $50. Huge thanks to Dungeon Hunter 6 for sponsoring today's video. So with all that in mind, we can go through her kit. So her basic attacks are pretty standard. They're just the sword standard attacks with, in her case, she has a 4-hit combo that hits 4 times. And the only really unique thing about it is that her basic attacks actually do either Pneuma or Usha damage with this very, very tiny 13.8% multiplier, but it does count as Hydro damage. However, it does not apply Hydro. Now, as for her charge attacks, she does this cool flashy animation, and she will switch modes between her Pneuma and Usha variants. So we can see that she actually switches clothes as well, with the darker clothes being the Pneuma mode where she summons these 3 little guys, and these 3 little guys will attack her enemies. And once she switches over to her Pneuma alignment, which is the lighter clothes, then she summons the Singer of Many Waters, who heals the on-field character. So up next, let's talk about her elemental skill. Her elemental skill summons the Salon Solitaire, which consists of 3 separate hydro animals. We have an octopus, we have a seahorse, and we have a crab. Now, the seahorse is basically a single target damaging thing. The octopus does a little bit of AoE, I believe, and the crab has the biggest AoE, but also attacks the slowest. Really unique and important thing about these 3 minions is that when they hit an enemy, all the characters on your team will have their HP drained by a little bit. And she will keep on draining your character's HP until they are under 50% HP. If they are under 50% HP, then they will actually stop draining her teammate. Depending on how many characters have over 50% HP, for every character that has over 50% HP, including Furina on your team, her Salon Solitaire animals will each do 10% more damage for every character that currently has over 50% HP on her party. So it's important for Furina to basically keep her health as well as her team's health above 50% HP in order to get this nice juicy 1.4x multiplier. And keep in mind that this is its own unique multiplier similar to Yoimiya's elemental skill. So I wanted to go through each of her animals in more detail so that we can have an even more holistic understanding of her kit. And I went through and did a bunch of frame counting for a full 30-second cycle, and basically each of the animals will attack with their own individual attack speeds. The seahorse, which is Superintendente Shovel Marine, is basically a single target attacker and also attacks the fastest with an attack cooldown of roughly 1.65 seconds or so. And it actually has the highest overall single target DPS, and interestingly, it also applies Hydro every other shot. And the next animal on this list is actually the octopus. The octopus attacks about half as fast as the seahorse, which is about every 3.36 seconds or so. And the octopus is interesting because it also has a 1 out of every other shot ICD, which actually makes it apply Hydro much less often than the seahorse. And finally, we have the crab. The crab deals the biggest individual damage number, and what's really great about the crab as well is that it deals some AoE damage, and it also applies Hydro every single time that it attacks. For example, in total for the full scale, including all 3 animals attacking, so including that initial bubble hit, we can see that for the first 10 seconds she applies Hydro a lot of times, 8 entire Hydro applications, and we can see that she's drained about 22.4% of your entire team's health. Oh yeah, and one more detail about her elemental skill is that it generates 1 particle every 3 seconds. So over a 30-second rotation, generally speaking, you will gain about 9 to 10 Hydro particles from her elemental skill. Now, as for her healing mode, this thing's just pretty straightforward. Basically, it just heals the on-field target for this amount of health. Unfortunately, it deals no damage, it doesn't apply Hydro. Pretty much all it does is heal the current party member. Now, honestly, you won't really be using this much in Abyss 12 unless you absolutely need some emergency healing for some reason, but it is a nice quality of life thing for the overworld. Up next, we have her Elemental Burst. Now, her Elemental Burst is a bit complicated, but basically, your entire team will go into a universal revelry state. During this time, when nearby party members' HP increases or decreases, 1 fanfare point will be granted to Furina for each percentage point of their max HP by which their HP changes. So why is fanfare important? Because for each point of fanfare, you will gain 0.25% increase to the bonus damage multiplier for your entire team at talent level 10. So here I have a chart that shows you how much bonus damage you get from 0 fanfare to 400 fanfare. Now at Constellation 0, which the maximum amount of fanfare is 300, you will gain 75% bonus damage, which is absolutely huge. However, do keep in mind that in order for you to gain 300 fanfare, that means that each party member on your team needs to have their HP fluctuate by 75%. 75% times 4 equals 300 maximum fanfare, which equals 75% bonus damage. And this ties back into her elemental skill, which, as we saw earlier, the 3 animals when they attack actually decrease your entire party's HP, thus generating a lot of fanfare for that bonus damage. You also get some healing bonus as well for your fanfare points. At 300 fanfare, you will get about 30% healing bonus. Now, how can you tell how much fanfare that you have? There are visual indicators that are demonstrated by the sea animals popping up during her elemental burst. We can see that in this graphic. I believe that it is 75 fanfare, 150 fanfare, and 225 fanfare for each of these animations. And also this indicates 25% max fanfare, 50% max fanfare, and 75% max fanfare accordingly. Now, I don't know if the animations change once you have her Constellation 2, which increases the maximum amount of fanfare. So if one of you guys do know that down in the comments below, do let us know. And finally, there is a whoosh animation, which is honestly pretty hard to see when you hit 300 fanfare. Now, as for her talent priority, you definitely want to level both her elemental skill and elemental burst equally, and you can pretty much just ignore her basic attacks. So let's quickly talk about her passives as well. Her passive 1, basically when you overheal the on-field character, all the other characters in Furina's party will heal for 2% of their max HP once every 2 seconds for the next 4 seconds, therefore healing for an additional 4%. However, it's important to note that this healing source must come from someone else besides Furina. Now her second passive is an important one, and for every 1000 points of max HP, Salon Solitaire will gain bonus damage 0.7% for every 1000 up to a maximum of 28%. So at 40,000 HP, you will gain 28% bonus damage to her elemental skill. And finally, we also have this little bit, which basically makes her heal a little bit faster based on her max HP. Okay, so we have a few quick texts to go over for Furina, with the first one probably being the most practical that you can use regularly, is you can dash cancel her E to move a little bit faster. So if we press E, you see we can dash cancel to pretty much remove the animation of her doing her snazzy snap as well as her pose in order to animation cancel it by a little bit. Now let's say you swap her on and then you do her E and then her elemental burst. If you dash cancel, you will save roughly 15-ish to 20-ish frames. So, you know, we're talking about saving a quarter to a third of a second, right? It's not going to be like huge amounts of time saved, but still, it is still a micro optimization that is worth keeping in mind. Now, another tech that's pretty interesting is you can use her elemental skill, and after 20 seconds have passed, assuming that your animals have been attacking the same target the entire time, you can use her elemental skill again right after the crab attacks, which occurs at roughly 23 seconds after you initially cast your elemental skill. So you wait for about 3 additional seconds after her skill has come off cooldown, and then you will actually refresh your animal's attack cooldowns, and the crab will attack much faster than it otherwise would, because normally the crab takes 5 point whatever seconds in order to attack. However, right when you summon the crab, it will actually attack in about 2.5-ish seconds off the top of my head. So you're saving a 2.5 second cooldown on the crab's attack, and you're not really slowing down the attack speed of the other animals by doing this trick. So a very minor optimization, but still it is another tech that you can, you know, do with her for micro optimization. And finally, this last tech is a little bit less useful, but perhaps there will be some situations where you're going to want to do it. But you can actually buffer her charge attack after her N4. We can see there that unlike most sword characters who, if you try to buffer their attack after the last hit, they won't follow it up with a charge attack. However, Furina, with her N4, you can hold down the left mouse button and she will indeed do her charge attack. Now again, this isn't all that interesting or useful in my opinion, but perhaps someone will figure out a reasonable usage for it. And the last little detail about her elemental skill is that she can actually walk on water. So if you do know any other additional techs and tricks, do let us know down in the comments below. So up next, let's talk about her artifacts. Fortunately, at Constellation 0, it is actually pretty darn straightforward for Furina when it comes to her artifacts. Just use the 4-piece Golden Troop. There's really not much else to say about it. Now, I think the only other 4-piece artifact set that's really worth talking about is the 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith. Personally, I don't really recommend using this as you are sacrificing a lot of Furina's personal damage, and there's a very good chance that Furina is going to be one of the higher damage dealers on your team. And the 20% attack buff is unlikely going to make a big difference for the other characters in comparison to how much of a difference the 4-piece Golden Troop does for Furina. But still, she does make use of the 20% additional HP, and she's an extremely reliable activator for the Tenacity's buff, but she does not gain anything from the 20% attack that the Tenacity buff provides. However, still a viable option if that's the path that you want to go down. Now, 2-piece combinations are going to fall quite short of the Golden Troop, but they are okay and usable in the time being. If you're farming for the Golden Troop and you have some decent 2-piece combinations, you can definitely use those in the interim, but eventually you will want to switch over to the 4-piece Golden Troop. So let's next talk about Energy Recharge. Energy Recharge is tricky because it's always a moving target depending on the teams as well as the enemies that you fight, as well as do you have Favonius weapons on your team, etc, etc. With that in mind though, let's say Furina is your only Hydro character and you probably have one other character that's running the Favonius weapon on your team. Roughly 220% energy recharge should be good, and you should be able to comfortably fill her up most rotations. Now let's say you have one other Hydra on the team, like I don't know, a Xingqiu or even Mona even, or perhaps Kokomi, then about 160 to 180% energy recharge will be a good amount for having another Hydro character on her team. And finally, if you have her Constellation 4, or you have triple Hydro like Kokomi, Xingqiu, and Furina on the same team, well, you should be able to get away with around 120% or even less. Which brings us into talking about the main stats for her artifacts. For the timepiece, you want to go with an HP percent timepiece unless you need the energy recharge to have her elemental burst have really good uptime. Then an energy recharge timepiece is worth considering. Now for the goblet, HP percent and hydro damage are both good, and I actually just slightly recommend the hydro goblet for most players. But either way, an HP percent goblet or a hydro damage goblet are both extremely viable on her, and I would just use whichever one is better in terms of their substat rolls. Speaking of substats, you just generally want the usual stuff: crit rate, crit damage, HP percent, and enough energy recharge for whatever team that you're playing her with. And for stat balance, you always want the 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. And speaking of which, the circlet should be a crit circlet. Up next, let's talk about her weapons. There's going to be 3 primary types of Furina players overall. They're going to be the rich players that have her signature weapon. Then we're going to have the Genshin boomers who have the Festering Designer. And finally, we have the fish to play players who will probably use the Fluve Cendre Ferryman. Here's the chart for her weapons, and it's going to be as pretty much expected. But there are a few other weapons that are worth talking about. And also keep in mind that for this chart, I set a minimum energy recharge of 170%. Weapons that have energy recharge, you will be able to allocate other substats or perhaps even the timepiece into HP percent as well as crit. Hence why it's important to calculate the energy recharge in this case. Crazily enough, the Festering Desire is pretty much her second best option after her signature weapon, so Genshin boomers are sitting pretty with the Festering Desire, which is pretty awesome to see, but also a little bit not as awesome for newer players. And after the Festering Desire, the Primordial Jade Cutter is pretty much tied with the Festering Desire, especially at Refinement 1, but do keep in mind that the Primordial Jade Cutter provides a ton of crit rate, 44.1% crit rate at level 90, so you do want to keep an eye out for over crit, which means that you're going over 100% crit rate on your character, because any percent of crit rate over 100% is completely wasted. So just keep an eye on that for the Primordial Jade Cutter. Now, the next weapon that's worth talking about, which I don't even have on my account, is the Wolf Fang. So the Wolf Fang is actually pretty decent. However, you will want some refinements on it in order to eventually have it outperform even the Festering Desire. So yeah, there is that to keep in mind, that if you are a long-term Battle Pass buyer, you can get this thing to Refinement 5, and it is pretty recommended overall. And after these options, we have the Fluve Cendre Ferryman, and actually this weapon has another additional benefit in which you get quite a lot of energy recharge after using her elemental skill, I believe, for 5 seconds. And this is actually relevant because oftentimes if you battery characters, this is roughly when you would grab the particles, is after you use her elemental skill. Now, if you're just tired of having issues with burst uptime, you can absolutely just slap on a Refinement 5 Favonia Sword and she'll be able to provide energy particles for the rest of the team as well. But do keep in mind that for newer players that might not know this, the Favonia Sword does not proc off field. So you do need to have Furina on field in order to activate the Favonia Sword to generate the additional energy. Now after the Favonia Sword, I would personally recommend the Key of Kajni Sut. Now in terms of just being a stat stick and damage stick, this weapon is pretty solid, and you can even stay on field for a little bit after you use her elemental skill in order to provide an elemental mastery buff to the rest of your team. Then we have the Light of Foliar Incision. This is also a good stat stick for Furina. And then finally, we have pretty much all the other weapons on this list. Now, one really quick note about the Mist Splitters Reforged. When I mentioned her basic attacks dealing a little bit of hydro damage, a little bit of Hydro Uxia or Numa damage, that actual bit of Hydro damage actually counts towards a Mist Splitter stack. So, for example, if you just want to use the Mist Splitter with her, then you can absolutely take advantage of that one stack for a few seconds, but do keep in mind that the stacks wear off pretty quick, 5 seconds for the normal attack hitting an enemy, and 10 seconds for the elemental burst after you use it. So she's going to have a lot of downtime on the Mist Splitters Reforged. It's also worth noting that the Mist Splitters Reforged has a very high base attack, which means that it has a very low secondary stat, and that's why you don't see the Mist Splitter Reforged being higher on this list, despite even being able to take advantage of 3 full stacks for a percentage of her rotation. After that, there's honestly not really anything worth talking about, I guess, except for perhaps the Harbinger of Dawn. I think for newer players that don't have the above 4-star or even 5-star options, the Harbinger of Dawn is actually usable while you're leveling and while you're playing through the game, and especially if you pair her up with an on-field healer driver that can keep Furina topped up, like for example Kokomi or even Barbara. These characters can easily keep Furina topped up even while she's off field. Also, here's the full chart with whale options included. Feel free to pause it to take a look. So let's quickly blitz through her constellations before we get to the most important part of the video, which is the teams section. Her Constellation 1 is just absolutely goated and immediately adds 150 fanfare when you use her burst, and finally it increases her fanfare from 300 to 400, which turns the maximum fanfare buff from 75% bonus damage to 100% bonus damage. You only need to generate 250 fanfare to go from 150 to 400 fanfare versus the original need to generate 300 fanfare in order to get the maximum fanfare buff. Her Constellation 2 is even crazier. It increases the amount of fanfare you get by 250%, and for every fanfare over the 400 limit, Furina will gain additional max HP. For this chart and calculation, I only assumed 40% additional HP, but we can even see her do even more damage thanks to this constellation, which is absolutely crazy. Constellation 3 increases the amount of fanfare you get by increasing the talent level of your ultimate, and it's actually a pretty substantial increase. It goes from 100% bonus damage buff with 400 fanfare to 124 bonus damage buff. Now her Constellation 4 helps mitigate her energy issues, and this means that you can actually run her with probably as low as 120 to 130% energy recharge. And afterwards we have her Constellation 5, which increases her elemental skill by 3 levels. And finally we have her Constellation 6, which there's a lot of stuff going here, but basically her normal and charge attacks after she uses her elemental skill for about 10 seconds will deal hydro damage now, and they will also gain HP scaling. So let's talk about Furina's teams. Now, I wasn't really sure where to put this in this video, so I decided to put it here. Basically, Furina actually provides additional value to her teammates besides just the obvious bonus damage. She drains your character's HP, which means that the on-field character can absolutely use the Marichasi Hunter to great effect. So this really benefits pretty much any normal attack or charge attack spamming character that would want to be on Furina's team. And also, it's worth noting that because her elemental skill provides so much bonus damage, up to 75% at Constellation 0 and up to 124% by Constellation 3, it actually dilutes the bonus damage multiplier and makes main stat goblets a little bit more valuable on your account. And for many team compositions, which back in the day without Furina, it's pretty much really rare to justify using a non-elemental goblet, there will be team combinations with Furina that are also actually practical team combinations where you might be better off using a main stat goblet over the elemental goblet. She can absolutely help gear your team as well by enabling the Marichasi Hunter for your main on-field DPS character, as well as opening up the possibilities of using main stat goblets. Now anyway, when it comes to actual teams for Furina, this is when, honestly the combinations are nearly endless. Now one thing is for certain though, we pretty much always want a full party healer to be paired with Furina. I mean, you don't always have to have one, but it is highly recommended. And here I've made an entire chart of all the full party healers for you guys to take a quick look at, as well as to take a quick look at their elements, my personal rating when it comes to pairing them with Furina, and finally a bit on their roles. And pretty much any healer on this list that I've rated 4 stars or above will be able to very quickly top off your entire team, as well as to provide some other type of additional value to your team. Now I wanted to quickly talk about the prototype Amber Generally speaking, when you run Furina with a teammate that has a prototype Amber, the prototype Amber doesn't quite provide enough healing to fully offset Furina's damage dealt to her team. So eventually you do need some other source of healing, like for example a weaker healer like Kuki Shinobu is a good one to pair, or even a single target healer like even Bennett can help shore up the lack of healing that the prototype Amber can't quite top off. And now let's start talking about some team archetypes, with the first team archetype being a Furina plus Neuvillette team. Furina plus Neuvillette leaves us with desiring an animal character in order to swirl Hydro, and you can either use Kazuha or Jean. Now each one has their own benefits. For example, if you use Jean, then you do not need a healer in the 4th slot, and you can choose someone with higher personal sub DPS, or you can choose another buffer like for example Zhongli. Let's say you run Kazuha instead. Kazuha does provide the most bonus damage as well as some grouping. You will want an AoE healer from this list to be added to the 4th slot. Now I personally found a lot of success as well as personally like Charlotte in this 4th slot a lot, because Charlotte can provide cryo, which also freezes the enemy. However, pretty much any non-hydro and non-animo healer will work in this 4th slot as long as you don't need to keep that character on field. Like for example, I don't recommend using Noelle with this team because Noelle has to be on field and has to hit the enemy a lot in order for her to properly heal the team. On a similar vein, I don't recommend Chi-Chi because Chi-Chi would have to stay on field as well. And finally, I don't recommend Barbara because Barbara is another Hydro character, and that means less Draconic stacks for Neuvillette. Another Neuvillette team that I did want to quickly mention is if you're using the prototype Amber, as I mentioned earlier, you can absolutely actually run a Hyper Bloom team with Kuki Shinobu as well as Nahida, because this way, with the prototype Amber healing your team and Kuki providing some supplemental healing herself, you should have enough healing to still be able to keep your team healthy and to gain a lot of additional fanfare stacks. However, do keep in mind that Furina's bonus damage buff doesn't actually apply to Hyper Blooms, but it does buff Nahida, Neuvillette, as well as her own personal damage, and the Hyper Bloom damage will still be quite good because, after all, it's Hyper Bloom. Now the next team is what I want to call the Waterbender team, and you're going to want Furina plus either Xingqiu or Yelan as the core 2 teammates for this team. Afterwards, for your 3rd character, generally speaking, Kazuha is the best because he can buff Hydro damage for both Furina and Xingqiu. And then for the 4th character, this is where you can get creative. But in my opinion, Kokomi really stands out because she is the overall best and highest benefactor from this type of team archetype, being an AoE healer and being a great driver for both Xingqiu and Furina. And Kokomi actually does some real substantial damage in comparison to, for example, Barbara, who you could use in this slot. But other characters that are noteworthy as a driver for this team include Charlotte, who is a healer, and finally you can even run pretty much any AoE healer in this slot. And for those that want to make less meta healers like Chi-Chi work, you can absolutely do this with this team as long as this healer is able to keep Furina and Xingqiu topped up, therefore gaining maximum fanfare stacks for this team. You should be able to clear most content just fine. Now of course this is not quite as optimal as running Kokomi here, but again it is one way to elevate some lesser used characters like Chi-Chi. Now alternatively, if you cover healing with Jean instead, this will allow you to slot in a different character here. Child can absolutely drive a mono Hydro team with Jean as the animo character as well as healer, because Jean heals a massive amount, so you're not going to have any issues topping up your team when it's Jean's turn to go. Another Hydro character that's worth mentioning that I think is pretty good for this is Ayato. You can absolutely run Ayato in this situation. And heck, there's no reason why you can't run Yelan and Xingqiu and Furina all in the same team, because you can just run triple off-field Hydro damage, and why not? So yeah, this is what I would describe as the Waterbender team, which is going to be a great archetype for Furina, and it's basically the same as Mono Hydro, but you have some flexibility as well. The next team archetype that I want to talk about is a Freeze team. Furina Freeze is pretty simple. You want to pair her with pretty much any of the top tier cryo DPS characters, and you want to pair her with either Jean or Kazuha. Let's say you use Kazuha here, then you're going to want a healer in this last slot, preferably someone like, for example, Charlotte, who can add a lot of cryo particles to this team, while also healing the entire team fairly comfortably. Now, another alternative approach, for example, you can swap off your cryo damage character, you can swap off Kazuha for Jean, and finally you can swap off Charlotte for a character like Shenhe, who will add a lot more cryo damage to this team. So yeah, as we can see, I believe Freeze teams are going to have a lot of potential, and you can mix and match as long as you have either a full party Animo healer like Jean or even Sayu, or a full party cryo healer like preferably Mika or Charlotte in the last slot. Now, the next team archetype is going to be a quick bloom team where you will have some hyper blooms, but thanks to Furina's somewhat lower hydro application, you will have great uptime on Quicken for Yae Miko to take advantage of. Of course, you can swap Yae Miko for any strong Quicken Electro DPS character like Kaching or Sino, and you'll have a good time. Alternatively, you can also swap out Nahida for a Dendro healer, like for example, Baizu or Yaoya. Of course, let's say you don't have a solid Electro DPS character for this, you can always just run a Hyper Bloom team with the 4th slot being very flexible. You can pretty much put in any healer here that's needed. You can throw in a Dendro healer, for example, like Yao Yao, I found great success with to be a little bit more free-to-play friendly. We can have a team like this with double Dendro plus Kuki plus Furina. So the next archetype is, of course, simply replacing Kuki with Toma or Dea in order to run a Burgeon team. And of course, you can mix and match your Dendro characters as needed. And finally, one team that I think is a bit underrated, but it's actually a vape team. And it's not a reverse vape team like what we're used to. Like, for example, with a child team, you are trying to reverse vape Xiangling's damage. No, on this team, you can actually vape a ton of Furina's damage. So yeah, I personally think there's some potential here, and this type of team archetype will need to be explored a bit more. We can swap out Xiangling even for other pyro characters like Klee, or this team archetype is pretty early on in its infancy, at least to me. I'm sure other people have tried it a lot and have more feedback on it, but I think there's potential for Furina forward vape teams. And the next team archetype, as we can see, there's just so many team archetypes. You know, I've been talking so much, but the next one that's worth mentioning, it's kind of special in terms of that, you know, it's its own archetype, is a Wanderer team. This will require additional exploration as well, but Mika provides Wanderer extremely valuable attack speed and the full party heal for Furina. Of course, Farzan is an insane support for Wanderer, but you can replace Farzan for a character like Bennett or even Constellation 4 Jean as needed. Now, a lot of people have been asking if Furina is good with Hu Tao, and this is actually pretty tricky to properly answer. I think it's going to take like some serious DPS sims as well as just a lot of testing in order to actually answer that question. But at the very least, you can absolutely use Furina with Hu Tao, but you have some opportunity costs for sure. For example, if you focus on actually healing up your entire party to get more fanfare, as well as to have Furina do more damage with her elemental skill, Hu Tao will lose the 33% pyro damage bonus from being under 50% HP, at least for a lot of the time. Anyway, my point is that there are some clear opportunity costs, but after trying it out, it feels perfectly fine, and in fact, it feels quite good. So I can't answer as to whether this is an upgrade from, for example, Xingqiu Yelan and Zhongli, but I can say that it feels perfectly usable. Oh my gosh, guys. Okay, so that was a ton of talking. And I'm not going to edit this video like crazy, but if you've made it this far already, that means that you've already seen this video not being edited too much, because there's just way too much information that I just needed to talk about and get across to you guys about this character. One of the most complex and flexible characters that we've had to date, and as such, I believe the length of this video will probably reflect it. Let me know if you guys learned anything new in this video. Personally, I think the team section can be even further explored. You could probably run double Pyro, double Hydra. There's just way too much you can do with this character that I honestly can't talk about in less than probably like 10 hours, frankly. Like, there's just an outrageous number of viable combinations when it comes to utilizing Furina. Let me know if I missed anything that you think is important. Leave that as a comment down below to also let other viewers of this video know something important that you know about Furina that I might have left out. Speaking of which, for the rest of you, go down and check the comments to see if there are any corrections or if anyone else has shared some valuable information. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Went to Lose, signing out.